Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a massive Mario guy. He's been a massive part of my gaming life for literally as long as I can remember, and his various platforming adventures rank up there as some of my absolute favorites of all time. But man, even as a kid, I've always preferred the chaotic intensity of Mario Kart. The simple idea of all these characters that I love battling out on the raceway while throwing a whole myriad of crap at each other was enough to get 6-year-old me on board. But as I've went back to these games over the years, there's just so much about them that I find so admirable even to this day. The games are incredibly skill-based, and you have the potential to get really good at them. But on the flip side, they also have this element of randomness and sheer unadulterated chaos that makes these games, for better or worse, incredibly entertaining. It's a formula that is admittedly pretty simple, but it's one that every game in the series has their own distinct take on, constantly adding new mechanics and gimmicks that adds even more variables to the core racing. It's really things like this that makes this series so incredibly fun to look back on. Any one of these games could be your favorite, given just how much each has going for them. But for as well as this formula worked, it took quite a bit of time to actually get to that point. In fact, it functioned entirely different just a couple of decades earlier. The Mario Kart series is unique from most others in the sense that it didn't ever feel the need to completely start over or reinvent itself with each new entry. It was mainly a series about iteration and adding a new gimmick to keep the formula staying fresh, and I feel like that's part of the reason why these games are so easy to understand at their core. It's the exact same thing except with its own special twist. But I mean, even still, if you go back and play some of the older ones, you can definitely feel a difference in how they play and control. And at no point in the series was this difference any more drastic than the series' origins. Super Mario Kart, Mario Kart 64, and Mario Kart Super Circuit were the trilogy of games that mainly shared a much different take on what a Mario Kart game could look like. I mean, they're not entirely different, the core gameplay loop is pretty much unchanged. But these older games just have that special something to them. Something that seems to scare many people away, but only ever draws me in closer. I'm gonna sound like a loser for saying this, but I've always had an interest and fascination with learning these games. And when I say that, I'm not talking about speedrunning or doing all kinds of game-breaking stunts like this one, but I'm more so talking about just learning how to play each of these games effectively. I never really played these games against anyone else, mainly because I didn't have any friends, but I've had this mentality for every single Mario Kart game I've played, and when learning these first 3 games, I was able to find some legitimate enjoyment in them. Enjoyment that I feel that most casual Mario Kart players won't entirely understand. You truly have to be a certain type of player to get the most out of these games, and I feel like if most were to get past all their flaws and jank, they simply wouldn't see what I see in them. But granted, I haven't really played many of these games in years. I mean, I've gone back to Super Mario Kart here and there, but I haven't touched 64 or Super Circuit in a very long time. So I'm open to the fact that my perception of these games could entirely change. But there's something to enjoy in every Mario Kart game, and even if they don't end up appealing to me, I'm sure I'll find something in them to at least enjoy. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, nerds and geeks, and all my queer and non-binary peeps, let's take a look into the interesting inception of Mario Kart. Now, I feel it's important to show just how different the racing game scene was prior to Mario Kart coming out. Because, I mean, by that point, there were still a lot of racing games available across both the NES and the Super Nintendo. However, the wall that many of these games blazed right into was the fact that there wasn't really anything setting them apart from each other. There wasn't really any character or charm, and at the end of the day, they were just games that simulated driving. That was pretty much the entire deal. However, at the time, that's really all they needed to be. Races were a lot different from most other sports games in the sense that they were generally used to showcase the graphical capabilities of the systems. Because while soccer and tennis did have their hurdles, simulating driving on these consoles was a lot harder to do and took a much greater ton of effort. and many of the devs did some heavy experimentation to simultaneously make the games fun while also make them look technically impressive. But by the time the 90s rolled around and technology made a bit more progress, we'd end up with two of the most influential racing games ever made. One of them was the absolutely iconic F-Zero, being a really good arcade racer in its own right, while also showing the world what the future of racing games could look like thanks to the introduction of Mode 7. But that same technology would also be used to kickstart an entirely new formula for one of the most revered and beloved video game franchises of all time. And that formula would come to pass with Super Mario Kart, known to many as the birth of the kart racer. As previously mentioned, out of the three games that I'll be looking at today, this is the game that I have the most amount of experience with. Okay, it's not by a lot, I don't go back to this game every other weekday, but this is one that I tend to revisit every now and again, and I've probably put more time into learning this one than I feel is normal. Generally speaking, this is people's least favorite Mario Kart. Yeah, I got the series up and rolling, but there are still a lot of things about it that just turns a lot of people off. And while I can totally understand and acknowledge this game's shortcomings, I obviously wouldn't have revisited this game as much as I did if I didn't find something in it to enjoy. And I'm going to try to explain that something as best as I possibly can. But with that being said, I'm not really sure where to start with this game. There's not much you can really say about it right when you boot it up. However, I do think that the character roster is quite an interesting time capsule. Pretty much every Mario character you could possibly want to race as at the time was here and accounted for. But also keep in mind that Super Mario World was the latest mainline Mario game by that point, and the Mario universe wasn't nearly as big as it is now. But even still, I can commend the variety that they were able to squeeze out of such a small pool of characters, each coming equipped with their own stats and specialized in different areas of play. But also, this is just one of those things about this first game that's just so fun to look back on, and I always find it so interesting comparing this to something like Mario Kart Double Dash or Wii, and just seeing how big the series will eventually become. But as for the cups, they pretty much function the same way as every other racing game. The only major difference is that unlike future games, these cups actually contain 5 tracks as opposed to 4. And when taking a look at the tracks themselves, not gonna lie, they don't look all that great. Again, similar to F-Zero, this game uses the elusive Mode 7 feature of the Super Nintendo, which allows the devs to stretch and scale out the background elements of their games. So as you can see, it's a no-brainer as to why a feature like this would completely revolutionize the racing game scene. However, with all this technology, it would ultimately come at a cost, because since that this only applied to the background elements of these games, many of these tracks would have very flat designs that have next to nothing in terms of visual variety. Really, the only things that are different about them was how wide the turns were. Now, thankfully, Super Mario Kart makes an attempt to add some visual finesse to these tracks. Again, seeing that Super Mario World was the latest Mario game at the time, we see a lot of themes heavily based on the aesthetics of that game. The Donut Plains, the Choco Mountains, and even the ghost houses get referenced. And I just find it very cute that even when the entire franchise was still in its infancy, they still found creative ways to give this game some actual flair and honest-to-God character. Hell, even the sprites that they use in this game are so expressive and goofy, even if I do kinda worry about some of them. Like, how did Koopa Troopa's eyes get like that? And how long has Yoshi's tongue been out like that? Then again, I don't really care, but still. However, it's not all shine sprites and rainbow roads, because although this game does have distinct areas that you can drive through, they get repeated a lot throughout the game. Most of the tracks you race on are just variations off of the same 6 themes, and even though it's adorable how they all reference Mario World, after a while they all do kinda start to blend together. So in practice, they essentially end up crashing to the exact same wall as many of its contemporaries did. Again, I still appreciate how it attempted to do this, and to be fair, although it's not severe, many of the games to come will also have tracks that look pretty damn identical to each other. But yeah, bottom line, these tracks aren't really anything all that special. But the gameplay on the other hand, that's the textbook definition of special. Super Mario Kart is notoriously the most difficult game in the entire series when it comes to a lot of things. For starters, these carts control nothing like how they do in the newer games. They're a lot more loose, which makes it pretty easy to run off the road. Turning is generally a lot heavier than it should be, which makes it pretty easy to run off the road. And unlike every other Mario Kart you've played, you don't get a little boost after you drift, which is annoying, but also makes it pretty easy to run off the road. Really gotta hand it to the devs, they really checked all the boxes for the amount of ways one could potentially run off the road in this game. But in all seriousness, whenever people complain about this game, the controls are always the very first thing that they bring up, understandably so. Messing with your muscle memory is one thing, but I'd go as far to say that it takes an entirely new skill set to truly understand and enjoy this game. It's no longer a game about finding the most optimal places to use items or pull off mini turbos. It's instead a game about figuring out the most optimal way to drive. However, I've been kind of ignoring the elephant in the room here, because not only is winning one of these races dependent upon how well you manage to stay on the track, but it also depends on your tolerance for this game's bullspit. Because another major issue with this game is that your opponents cheat. They just flat out cheat. A lot. They can use character-specific items whenever they want. They can straight up jump over items because lol, why not? And I'm also assuming that a lot of them are dead because they can just straight up phase through solid objects. Who knew?
But wait!
We are not done, because we also have to talk about the fact that this game just doesn't like you. It has some very sketchy design choices, like how if you run out of coins, you'll start spitting out upon bumping into people, or how some of these tracks have some of the most infuriating layouts of all time. The thwomps are only one instance of this, but the stage hazards too are also just incredibly annoying. Yes, I get that they're there to make the game more challenging, but man, like especially while playing in the higher engine classes, these things just won't get out of your freaking room. But yes, we got ourselves 3 engine classes, which are essentially a glorified difficulty selector, with 150cc being the hardest one. I think it's a very clever system, 50cc gets newbies into the swing of things, and 150 is a test for how well they truly understand the mechanics of the game. However, although I generally enjoy playing Mario Kart games on the highest CC because I desperately need to see the following things on screen, this game I'm generally okay with sticking with 100. 150cc is insanely fast and the CPUs are way too obnoxious for me to even try. Although 150 is indeed unlockable, it's actually one of the only unlockables in this game aside from the Special Cup, only in 100cc and up for some reason. But okay, I've been pretty harsh on a game that I said and I quote, found something enjoyable in. This is a very flawed game and has issues that I really couldn't blame anyone for not tolerating, especially when most are playing this game on the same console that also has this on it. I mean, why not just go and play that one? But even with all those critiques being said, despite it all, I still really like this game. As stated earlier in the video, I've always had a fascination in learning how to truly master each and every game in this series. To me, that is why I still love this series and replay these games so often. I genuinely find it fun pushing through the jank and replaying these courses as many times as I feel is necessary to truly understand these games. It still definitely took some time, but when pushing through the jank of this game, I was greeted with a game that, the more I look at it, has an entirely different appeal from the rest of the series. This is, for all intents and purposes, a skill-based Mario Kart game. More than any other game in the series, it's punishing, it's demanding, and it's incredibly difficult. But man, that's the exact thing that I've always admired about it. It's weird, I know, it doesn't really make much sense, but I just find everything about the mechanics and the core driving to be so fun in its own unique way. It feels so good to effectively utilize things like the drift in this game, for as loose as it is, figuring out the most precise way to drift around every turn is incredibly satisfying but in a completely different sense. But again, this game doesn't mess around with testing how well you can move around the track, because for as difficult as they can be, there's always a way to skillfully blaze through each of them. There are even some advanced techniques you can learn about, like abusing the little bounce before you drift to take turns a lot sharper, or how you can simply let go of the accelerate button to achieve the exact same thing. It's because of all these things, in combination with how relentlessly aggressive the other drivers are, that creates one of the most engaging Mario Kart experiences out there. There's such a layer of intensity to all of these races. It's one of the few Mario Karts that has me on the edge of my seat every single time I see that point counter, because having fun and doing well in this game all comes down to you being engaged 100% of the time. And again, it all comes down to whether or not you're willing to put in the work. You could argue that I like it for all the wrong reasons, but I still think that the mechanics and the control, although they have indeed aged, still have their own unique qualities. This is just a very interesting and different type of Mario Kart game, and it's because of that fact why I still revisit this game from time to time. Being 100% honest though, I'd still rather play most of the newer stuff, but sometimes I want something a bit more challenging, a bit more intense, and something that's just the slightest bit unfair. I like this one. It may not be for everybody, but this is still a game that I'm very happy to go back to whenever the time is right. But speaking of time, Super Mario Kart would go on to do numbers, becoming the 4th best-selling Super Nintendo game of all time. For as divisive as it is nowadays, back then it received critical and commercial acclaim from most publications at the time, and single-handedly gave birth to what would now be known as the kart racer subgenre. Nintendo obviously took note of this success, but by that point, they were already hard at work on their new console, so that left many people in the dark as to if a new Mario Kart was even a possibility. But approximately 5 years later, in 1997, the world would finally be able to see what the sequel to Super Mario Kart would look like in the form of Mario Kart 2, Mario Kart 64. I know, it rolls right off the tongue. To so many people, this is where Mario Kart truly started to feel like Mario Kart. It's the game that really started to introduce a lot of the series' mainstays. But as previously stated, I haven't touched this one in an embarrassingly long time. I remember thinking that it was just okay. It was a game that existed, but then again, there's a very high chance that I could be completely wrong on that. Everyone seems to love this one, or at the very least respect it for further expanding on the franchise's gameplay. However, after spending a good amount of time with it, do I consider myself to be one of those people? Well, let's start with the character roster, as there have actually been a few additions this time around. DK Jr. and Koopa Troopa both got the boot, and are instead replaced with Rare's version of Donkey Kong and Wario, both of which are changes that make total sense. Rare's DK is what many people think of when they think of Donkey Kong, and really, even though both these guys get the same point across, which do you honestly remember more? And Wario, I like how his design rounds out the heavyweights, and his more chunkier appearance again gives his roster more variety. But like last time, each of these characters come equipped with their own different attributes for racing. But I actually find that MK64 does a better job at really making the strengths and weaknesses more apparent. Certain weight classes get their own little perks. For example, lightweights can not only turn a lot sharper, but they also can recover a lot quicker from getting assaulted with an item. And heavyweights, which not only have the best top speed in the entire game, but can also spin out other racers simply by running into them. This feature alone makes these objectively the best guys to play as. Their acceleration is supposed to be the worst of the bunch, but I find that they don't really get back to their top speed much faster than the medium weight characters, and plus, characters like Wario have insanely good turning for a heavyweight, on top of having the best top speed in the game and the ability to knock people out of his way. In all honesty, Wario might just be my favorite character to play as in this entire game, and that is the only time I'll ever form a sentence out of those words. But no, like in all seriousness, the fact that people can have dedicated mains and gravitate towards a certain playstyle is something that I truly admire. Games like Super Mario Kart did this too, but I never really felt compelled to pick a main character. And even to this day, with games like Mario Kart 8, I always end up just picking a character because I like them, they're my favorite character, I want to race as them, leave me alone, Dad! But in this game, there are distinct characters that I tend to perform better with. And a pretty big reason as to why the heavyweights especially are so good has to do with the massively revamped drifting system. That's right, nerds and geeks, this is the game that has the drifting system that you and I are more used to. You now have full control over the drift and can get a slight boost upon completing one. However, even though I'm glad that the drift is more in line with the newer games, that does little to undermine some of the other control quirks because, oh man. Alright, so I'm just gonna go ahead and assume that the devs received the criticism of the last game about the controls being too loose, and in response to that, they went ahead and made the turning extremely sensitive. To be fair, it's not unplayably so, and thanks to the drift, I can say that this game overall feels better to control than Super, but it isn't really by much. It's sensitive to the point where it's honestly quite slippery, and I just don't like the feeling of driving on ice as I play these games. Shh, okay? Shh. We'll get to you later. But also, like similar to Super, this game just doesn't like you. I already mentioned how the heavyweights can make you spin out, but my god, you could spin out and crash for some of the stupidest reasons in this game. Whether it be slamming into a wall at a very specific angle, or just running into a character the wrong way. And also, I lost track of the amount of times I tried to drift, but the game just doesn't let you. Like there were times where I even tried doing it back to back and the game just didn't feel like registering it that time. I don't know, it's weird. The controls of this game are just weird. And unfortunately, the rest of the game doesn't really fare much better. Now, something that this game does unquestionably better is how it handles the items. First off, there are a lot more of them this time around, having a grand total of 14. Most do return from last time, but they've seen a few changes and were given a ton of new general improvements. You can now hold down the item button to hold items behind you, which allows for a much more reliable way of defending yourself. And items like the banana peel now have a triple variant, but instead of having 3 bananas trail behind you, you get 5. I mean, I'm not complaining or anything, I was just very blatantly lied to. Also, it could just be me, but whenever you hold a banana or fake item box behind you, it feels like you go faster? Not entirely sure how that works, but okay. Also, yes, the fake item box is one of the new items added to this game, alongside the golden mushroom, the boo item, and the infamous blue shell, being the rarest item in the game, as well as attacking a few of the racers in front of you before it reaches its first place target. In short, this item isn't a pain in my rear end. Neither are any of these items, to be honest. They all function really well, and in general, they succeed in adding a layer of chaos to the racing without going too overboard with it. Also, one last thing that I want to mention about the items is that CPU exclusive items are gone. Everyone has access to the exact same arsenal, which makes this game feel a lot more fair and balanced. Although, now that I mention it, I don't think I've ever seen a CPU use lightning or the golden mushroom before, but again, not complaining. But the courses themselves, on the other hand, have a lot to be discussed. Look, I really wanted to love these tracks so badly. Just off of how they look and the general aesthetics and theming, these tracks are among some of the best in the entire franchise. Nearly every single track has such a radically different atmosphere. They're all just so imaginative and creative, much more so than the aesthetics found in Super. And in general, the fact that these tracks now have actual geometry and feature things like slopes and hills goes such a long way for making these tracks feel more immersive and feel more like a place that could actually exist. And when talking about the music that plays during these tracks, oh my god, okay. I didn't really mention much about the music in Super, mainly because very little of the themes really stuck with me. but Mario Kart 64 might just have one of the best OSTs in the entire series. The entire soundtrack, similarly to the courses, features a plethora of different sounds and instruments, which all makes each of these tracks come to life. I simply can't get enough of the happy-go-lucky and whimsical energy of Yoshi Valley, the western flair of Choco Mountain, the easygoing and relaxing vibe of Koopa Troopa Beach, and the adrenaline-fueled excitement and exhilaration of all of the Raceway themes. They're all so good. Obviously, not all the songs are good, and many of them do appear more than once within the game, but really, I just don't care, because this soundtrack has some amazing stuff within it. By far my favorite thing about this game. I know that last part was a bit unnecessarily harsh, but I'm sorry, I just don't like actually racing on any of these tracks. Like, I genuinely love the fact that these courses have actual geometry and stuff, but just, it doesn't really amount to much when a whole lot of these tracks are just very bland and boring. These incredibly imaginative and inspired themes rarely ever come to life because of how empty and overly spacious these tracks are. However, on the opposite side of the spectrum, some of them are filled with some of the most obnoxious hazards ever put into a Mario Kart game and have designs that are just annoying. Like, I swear, the hazards in this game are so much worse than Super, and so many of them are placed in the most despicable of places and are unnecessarily difficult to properly dodge given this game's control. And since I brought up this game's control, I just don't feel like these courses were really made with them in mind. These tracks are filled with all these different obstacles that have all these incredibly sharp turns, and trying to navigate and dodge a lot of these isn't only incredibly annoying, but more importantly, it just doesn't feel good. I'm sorry, but I just do not like these courses in this game. They're either incredibly dull or completely obnoxious. But again, like, I have to stress, I love these courses in terms of their theming and just in terms of their variety. And usually when these courses are brought back in future games, I genuinely get excited and end up having a blast replaying them. But then again, in most of those games, I'm not putting up with problematic controls and god-awful stage hazards. Even though with some of the stages like Sherbert Land or DK Parkway or Calamari Desert, there really is just no saving. Those stages suck. But man, I've really been putting this one through the ringer, haven't I? Mario Kart 64 is such a strange game in this franchise, and as I've made it pretty clear within these last couple of minutes, it has a lot of problems. And I mean, prior to making this video, I really couldn't tell you where I'd rank it against the other games, but I could say with a good degree of confidence that this is my least favorite game in the series so far. However, even though I said that, I just can't bring myself to hate this game, man. I can't, because even though this game is deeply flawed, there's still so much about this game that I genuinely love. I already mentioned how much I love the aesthetics and the items and the music. However, that's not even mentioning just how much personality and character that is just beaming from this game. This is the very first Mario Kart to fully feature voice acting, and I've always just had a fondness for these voice lines and the things that these characters yell towards each other, for as stupid and as weird as they are. The whole not 3D graphic style that this game goes for is also just incredibly cute. I've always been a sucker for the Doom style of 3D in many of these early 5th gen games, and this is easily one of the best instances of this, in my opinion. And bro, the amount of little details and visual touches that are in this game is actually insane. Pretty much everything that happens to you in this game has text that portrays a different sound effect, making this game feel like it came right out of a cartoon. It's thanks to all these things that manages to give this game such a strong sense of charm that not many other games in the series really have. And despite shortcomings, I just can't ignore the amount of cool things that this game does. There's a lot to love in this game. There's a lot of people who have such a strong fondness for it, and even with its glaring flaws, again, I just cannot bring myself to hate this game. And I mean, the general public sure didn't, because in terms of sales and reception, Mario Kart 64 did even better than Super Mario Kart, becoming the second best-selling game on the Nintendo 64, pushing nearly 10 million units. Pile that with this game seeing damn near universal acclaim by every major gaming network, and it became pretty clear to Nintendo that Mario Kart was here to stay, and it was a series that was pretty much required to be on every single Nintendo console from there on out. However, for this next game, the devs who had worked on Mario Kart up until this point, Nintendo EAD, actually wouldn't go on to make it. It was 2001 by this point, and they were heavily working on games for the up-and-coming Nintendo GameCube. So in order for them to fill their Mario Kart quota, they did a series first and outsourced the game to Intelligent Systems to develop the game for the Game Boy Advance. Now, Intelligent Systems 2 was also busy working on games for the time, especially for this system, but even still, in summer of 01, they dropped the first Mario Kart game for a handheld, Mario Kart 3 Super Circuit. Now that makes much more sense. So prior to making this video, this was by far the Mario Kart that I had the least amount of experience with. I didn't really play it much more than 64, but I didn't remember putting a lot of time into this one. So out of all the games that I've talked about in this behemoth of a script, this was the one that I was the most eager to go back to. However, generally, reception of Super Circuit has been pretty mixed, with both critics and fans agreeing that while the game itself is still good, it's seen as a pretty substantial step back in terms of pretty much everything. But you wanna know what's interesting? Despite all that, this might just be my favorite of the games I've looked at thus far. And here's why. Taking a look at the roster of characters, everyone who appeared in Mario Kart 64 reappears in this game, with no new additions or omissions anywhere in sight. In terms of the Grand Prix, we actually got 5 cups to play as opposed to 4, the Lightning Cup being the main new one of the group, which is usually relegated to the retro tracks. More on that later. In terms of the actual game itself, it's sure Mario Kart alright. What you see here is pretty much what you get with this game. It's the gameplay and controls of Super Mario Kart fused with the aesthetics and sprites of Mario Kart 64. However, something that I picked up on within minutes of playing is just how much better the controls are. The handling isn't too loose, but it also isn't overly precise and sensitive. It nails a very good balance between the two, and I all around feel more in control of where my kart is going. It's obviously not perfect, it doesn't feel as smooth as some of the newer stuff, and something that this game actually does worse is the fact that you can no longer abuse the little bounce to take turns sharper like in Super. But those aren't huge losses, and if anything, it's more of me just having to do a little bit of adjusting. And overall, these controls really did impress me, as do a lot of things in this game. Just to list off a few things, the items more or less function as they do in 64, but function 10 times better here. The fact that they more or less took the sprites from 64 and squished them down to work on the Game Boy Advance was a huge technical showcase for the system, and a lot of these tracks are just incredible. The music featured in these courses are also really good. I mean, I know I'm a little bit biased, I do have a soft spot for the Game Boy Advance's sound hardware, for as lacking as it is, and the trippy, crunchy tunes that play during all these tracks are just straight bops, I'm sorry. But the important thing that I want to emphasize is just how much better these tracks are designed. The turns are generally a lot wider, which makes taking turns feel a lot better, and the hazards are nowhere near as obnoxious as in the last two, and are placed in areas that aren't psychotic. There are still a couple of annoying ones though, like Snowland I didn't really like that much. I hate how the screen constantly shakes, and although I get that it's trying to simulate driving over ice and how shaky it is, I don't know, the 8 version did it better. Sunset Wilds is also a pretty annoying one, specifically because of the Shy Guy tents, because they're one of the only hazards in the game that actually managed to piss me off. They are such a pain to whack off your cart, but man, like every other track is really good, and it's just an absolute blast to race through, much more so than the other two. But actually, there's a lot more to this game than what you might initially see, because this game introduces 2 pretty big mainstays. First off, there's Quick Run, which is more or less a different name for Versus Mode, and functions the exact same way. You get to choose whatever track you want to race on, and apparently it's not part of a Grand Prix, so you can just play these tracks as many times as you want. Neat. But then we also have the introduction of retro tracks, in my opinion, one of the best things that the series has ever introduced, ever. Like, having new tracks in these types of games are a given, So I always thought that bringing back fan favorite courses was always a smart idea, and especially in these newer games, these courses can be damn near unrecognizable as old courses, and take so many creative liberties that they might as well be brand spanking new. However, the retro tracks in this game are particularly interesting, because seeing that there are only 2 games out by this point, one of which had courses that are way too complex for the Game Boy Advance, this game more or less ports over the entirety of Super Mario Kart. Yep, you heard right, every single course from that game is playable in this one, meaning that there is now a grand total of 40 tracks in this game. My goodness. But even with the generous amount of content, I still have my critiques with these stages, because although the visuals look just as good as the rest of the game, you can definitely tell that they pretty blatantly reused a lot of them for these remakes, which does kinda devalue them in my eyes. And when talking about the actual courses themselves, they're just okay. They don't really leave much of an impact, and the big reason as to why is due to just how short they are. All of these tracks can be completed in less than a minute due to the amount of laps being reduced, which actually makes these tracks feel more dated in this version. And also, for some reason, a lot of the stage hazards from that game just aren't present here. A few tracks definitely benefit from this, but a grand majority of them don't really change all that much. I don't know, altogether these courses were a bit of a letdown. They function well and their quality hasn't really changed that much at all, but they just aren't very exciting. And something that doesn't help at all is the way in which you go about unlocking them, because apparently you have to manually unlock them via collecting 100 coins after each of the Grand Prix. Why? To be honest, it isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's just kinda extra and it's confusing for literally no reason. But I don't know, I'm not a game designer, I don't know what I'm talking about, so I should probably shut my stupid mouth. But regardless, God, this game was so good. And I gotta be honest, I was not expecting to say that at all. As a follow-up to Super Mario Kart and as a standalone entry in the series, this game was a pretty huge step backwards in literally every way. It took a step back to the asymmetrical style of Mario Kart and didn't look to add anything or advance the series in any meaningful way. But man, I just don't care. The quality and polish in this thing is undeniable. Even with its limitations and shortcomings, I still had more fun playing this game than any of the other 2. The tracks were excellent, the music was charming, the graphics and art style haven't aged a day, and despite its execution, the fact that it introduced the idea of retro tracks to the series was huge. I was pleasantly surprised with this one. And after all those years of kind of ignoring it and pushing it to the side, I can say with absolute certainty that this probably won't be my last time going back to it. Good job, Super Circuit. Good job. Well, that was one mess of a video. I'm so sorry. Again, as I said 17 years ago when you first clicked on this video, many of the reasons why I like these games just don't make any sense. Writing this script and thinking about how to make my points make sense was a pretty large hurdle for me to jump over. Hell, you probably might have watched or listened through it and thought that half the stuff I was saying was complete malarkey, which in all seriousness is totally valid because, yeah, I do like these games for a lot of very weird reasons. The difficulty, the jank, the dated controls are things that seem to scare so many people away, and are just something that people just don't want to spend the time to actually adjust to. However, while I can totally acknowledge the fact that those are issues that detract from the experience, it just all comes down to that special something about these games. A something that even now I still haven't gotten to the bottom of. I don't know, just each of these games have a sort of retro appeal that I can't really explain. I can enjoy the looseness and intensity of Super Mario Kart. I love the well-roundedness and pure quality of Super Circuit, and even though it's probably my least favorite game of the series, I could still admire the charm and creativity oozing out of Mario Kart 64. And it really is exclusive to Mario Kart 64, because all of these games have their own charming vibe, and that right there is a series-wide pro. It's part of the reason why I have so much affection for it. No game in this franchise is objectively perfect or is 100% going to gel with everyone. But man, these games do and accomplish so many different things that pretty much any one of them can be your favorite. There are still so many other things about these games that people love and cherish even beyond the core racing. That precedent was set with these 3 games. Games that were incredibly ambitious, especially for their time, and single-handedly kickstarted the Mario Kart series as well as an entirely new subgenre along with it. And while many respect them as dusty artifacts of what the kart racer used to look like, I respect them as pieces of history that have definitely aged, but have so much in them that still remain so cool and charming in their own outdated way. I may be the only one who thinks this, I may even be stupid, but this is something that I've always felt. Just gonna put obligatory ranking of the games here. Okay, bye!